May 18th, 1933. The Ob River, Siberia. A wooden barge slowly drifts toward a small, muddy strip of land in the middle of nowhere. On board, crammed into the cargo hold like cattle, are thousands of people. They're not soldiers, they're not prisoners of war. They're men, women, and children pulled off the streets of Moscow and Leningrad. They have no winter clothes for the freezing Siberian nights. They have no axes to build shelter, and they have no food. As the guards kick them off the barge into the mud, they toss ashore a few hundred sacks of raw flour. No ovens, no bowls, just flour and river water. What happened over the next 30 days is difficult to speak about. The guards called it a special settlement. The prisoners called it Death Island. But history remembers it by the name the locals gave it after they saw what washed up on the riverbanks: Cannibal Island. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a government experiment. And today, we are going to expose the documents that authorized it. The story of Nazino was buried in the KGB archives for decades because it reveals the absolute darkest corner of the human psyche. We are going to walk through this timeline day by day. If you have the stomach for the truth, click subscribe now. Join us as we open the files the Soviet Union tried to burn. And I want to start a discussion in the comments. Most people know about the gulags, the work camps, but Nazino was not a work camp. It was a dumping ground. My question to you is, do you believe that civilized people can turn into savages in just 72 hours? Or were these specific people broken before they arrived? Leave your thoughts below. I want to know what you think drives a human to the brink. To understand why 6,000 people were left to eat each other on a river island, we have to start not in Siberia, but in the polished offices of the Kremlin. The year is 1933. Joseph Stalin is preparing for the massive May Day holiday celebrations. Moscow needs to look perfect. It needs to look like the capital of a utopia. But the city is overcrowded. Refugees from the famine-stricken countryside are flooding in looking for bread. So the secret police, the OGPU, conceived a plan. They called it social hygiene. The goal wasn't to arrest criminals. The goal was to clean the streets. Genrik Yagoda, the head of the secret police, presented a plan to Stalin: the deportation of 2 million D-classed elements to colonize the empty vastness of Siberia. On paper, it looked like a grand economic project. In reality, it was a manhunt. The police were given quotas. They didn't care who they grabbed. They didn't look for dissidents or spies. They looked for anyone without a shiny new internal passport. The archives are full of tragic absurdities. There was the smoker. A man stepped out of his apartment to buy a pack of cigarettes. He left his passport on the kitchen table. He was grabbed by a patrol, thrown into a truck, and shipped to Siberia, still wearing his house slippers. There was the student, a young girl visiting her aunt in Moscow for the weekend. She was stopped at the train station. She had a ticket home, but no residency permit. She never saw her family again. There was the decorated veteran, a hero of the Civil War, wearing his medals, was picked up because he was sitting on a park bench looking idle. There were no trials, there were no judges. Within days, thousands of these random people, the human trash as the documents called them, were loaded into cattle cars. They thought they were going to a labor camp. They were wrong. They were going somewhere much worse.
The journey to Siberia was not a relocation. It was a culling. The thousands of people snatched from the streets of Moscow were packed into cattle cars, wooden boxcars designed for livestock, not humans. There were no seats, no windows, no toilets, just a hole in the floor and a bucket of water that ran dry in hours. For weeks, the trains rattled across the endless Russian landscape. Inside, the heat was suffocating. People began to die of dehydration and exhaustion before they even crossed the Ural Mountains. When the trains stopped at remote sidings, the guards simply opened the doors, dragged out the corpses, and left them by the tracks. But the physical conditions were not the only danger. The Soviet authorities had made a fatal bureaucratic error. In their rush to meet the deportation quotas, the police had mixed two very different groups of people in the same wagons. Group 1 was the urban elements, the shopkeepers, the students, the musicians, the pregnant women caught without passports, soft, civilized people. Group 2 was the Urkas. These were hardened career criminals, murderers and thieves released from overcrowded prisons to clear space. The authorities had locked the sheep in the pen with the wolves. By the time the trains reached the transit point in Tomsk, the Urkas had already established a brutal hierarchy. They stole the clothes off the dead. They took the meager rations from the weak. The violence had already begun. But Tomsk was not the destination. The local officials looked at this mass of starving, sick, and dangerous humanity and realized they had nowhere to put them. The prisons were full. So they decided to push the problem further down the river. They loaded nearly 6,000 people onto large timber barges. These were essentially floating coffins. The prisoners were kept below decks in the cargo holds. The air was so foul that matches wouldn't light. Dysentery and typhus spread like wildfire. Finally, on May 18th, the barges slowed down. The heavy wooden hatches were thrown open. The prisoners, blinded by the sudden sunlight, were ordered to disembark. They looked out at their new home. It wasn't a settlement. There were no barracks. There were no fences. There was no infrastructure of any kind. It was an island called Nazino. It was a narrow strip of swampy land, about 3 kilometers long and 600 meters wide, located at the confluence of the Ob and Nazina rivers. It was surrounded by freezing, fast-moving water. The guards forced everyone off the boats. Those too weak to walk were carried or dragged into the mud. As the barges pulled away to anchor mid-river, the 6,000 deportees stood on the wet ground. The wind was biting. Snow began to fall, not just ice, but heavy poplar fluff, covering the dead and the living alike. They had no tools, they had no medicine, they had no bedding, and then the realization hit them. There was no food. The only supplies left on the shore were sacks of raw flour dumped in a pile under the open sky. The sun went down on that first night. The temperature dropped below freezing, and on the dark island, the first screams began.
The sun rose on the second day, revealing a scene of absolute despair. The island was dotted with the bodies of those who hadn't survived the first night of exposure. The survivors, shivering and delirious, turned their eyes to the center of the island. There, the guards had stacked the sacks of flour. It was the only food available, 20 tons of raw rye flour. No meat, no vegetables, no yeast, and, critically, no ovens or utensils to cook it. The camp commanders decided to distribute the rations, but there was no system, there were no lines, there were no scales to weigh the portions. The guards simply dumped the sacks open on the muddy ground. The result was predictable. 6,000 starving people surged forward at once. It turned into a riot. Men and women trampled each other to get to the food. The Urkas, the criminal gangs, punched and kicked their way to the front, crushing the weaker intellectuals and the elderly into the dirt. The guards, panicked by the human wave, didn't try to organize the crowd. They raised their rifles and fired directly into the mass of people. The crowd scattered, leaving more dead bodies on the trampled earth. The distribution system changed. The guards forced the prisoners into brigades of 150 people. A brigadier, usually a ruthless criminal, was appointed to collect the flour for his group. Most of the time, the criminals simply took the flour for themselves and gave nothing to the others. But even for those lucky enough to get a handful of flour, the nightmare was just beginning. They had no bowls. They received the flour in their hats, in the hems of their coats, or simply in their cupped, dirty hands. And they faced a deadly problem. How do you eat dry powder? Starving people tried to swallow it dry. Many suffocated, choking as the fine dust coated their throats and lungs. The others ran to the riverbank. They mixed the flour with the freezing, contaminated water of the Ob River. They tried to make a crude dough in their hats. They ate this gray, sticky paste raw. The human body cannot digest raw rye flour mixed with river water. Within hours, dysentery swept through the island like a plague. The camp turned into a latrine. People were doubled over in agony, their stomachs bloating, bleeding out from the inside. By the third day, the island wasn't just cold and hungry, it was sick. The weak lay in the mud, too exhausted to move, clutching their stomachs. And as they lay there helpless, the criminals began to circle them, not eyeing their pockets, but their flesh. By the fourth day, civilization on Nazino Island had completely collapsed. The Soviet authorities had intended to create a settlement. Instead, they created a cage where the most violent impulses of humanity were rewarded. The guards, mostly young local recruits, were terrified of the prisoners. They stopped patrolling the interior of the island. They set up a perimeter on the shoreline and stayed there, rifles raised. This decision had a catastrophic consequence. It surrendered the 6,000 defenseless people to the mercy of the Urkas. The criminal gangs became the government of the island. They organized hunting parties, but they weren't hunting animals. There were no animals on Nazino. They were hunting the soft prisoners, the city dwellers, the elderly, the students. First, they hunted for clothing. In the freezing Siberian spring, a coat was worth more than a human life. The gangs would surround a victim, strip them naked, and leave them to freeze to death in the mud. The island soon became filled with naked battalions, groups of people huddling together for warmth, their skin turning gray and blue, waiting to die. Then they hunted for gold. The guards on the perimeter had established a gruesome black market. They wouldn't give out extra food for free, but they would trade. A loaf of bread or a pack of cigarettes could be bought for gold. The criminals began checking the mouths of the living and the dead. If they saw a gold tooth, they didn't wait for the person to die. They used rocks or rusty metal to knock the teeth out. The screams of these amateur dental surgeries echoed across the water. But the guards were not just passive observers, they were participants in the horror. Bored and drunk, the guards began to treat the island as a shooting gallery. If a prisoner got too close to the warming fires of the guard post, they were shot. If someone cried out too loudly in the night, they were shot. One historical report details how guards would shoot at prisoners simply to test their aim, betting cigarettes on whether they could hit a running man. The line between the jailers and the prisoners vanished. Both had become monsters. And as the hunger pains became unbearable, the final taboo was about to be broken. The dead bodies piling up in the tall grass ceased to be people. They began to look like meat. We are now approaching the darkest chapter of this story. What you are about to hear is documented in the official interrogation protocols of the Soviet police. It is the reason this file was classified for 60 years. Before we descend further into this hell, I need to ask you a favor. These stories are difficult to research and difficult to tell. If you believe that the victims of Nazino deserve to be remembered, please hit the like button on this video. It helps us break through the algorithm and show the truth to more people. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Now we look at what happens when humans lose their humanity. It started quietly. At first, the survivors only touched the dead. When a person died of cold or typhus, the hungry would crawl out of the tall grass. They would cut off the soft tissue, the calves, the thighs, and roast it over small fires. The guards on the perimeter saw the smoke. They smelled the burning meat. They knew exactly what was happening. They did nothing. But soon, The supply of the dead wasn't enough. The hunger was maddening. It twisted the minds of the living. The gangs stopped waiting for people to die. In the survivors' testimonies, there's a terrifying phrase used over and over: cutting calves. It became a common practice. Gangs would pin a weak person down. They wouldn't kill them. That was too much effort. They would simply cut strips of flesh from their legs and leave them there, alive and bleeding. People wrapped their legs in rags, sleeping in fear, knowing that their own bodies were now seen as food. One specific incident captured in the archives sums up the absolute horror of Nazino. A young guard named Kostya had taken a liking to a beautiful female prisoner. He decided to protect her. He brought her food. He let her sit by his fire. One day, Kostya had to leave his post for just a few minutes. He told the girl to stay close to the fire. When he returned, she was still sitting there, but she was pale. She couldn't speak. Kostya looked down. While he was gone, a gang had crawled up to the fire. They hadn't dragged her away. They had simply cut pieces of flesh from her legs while she sat there, too terrified to scream. The guard tried to help her, but it was too late. She died from blood loss in his arms. When he demanded to know who did it, the prisoners simply shrugged. "Why are you angry, citizen guard?" one of them asked. "It's just meat. She will die anyway." The island had ceased to be a place of humans. It was now a slaughterhouse. For the few prisoners who had managed to keep their sanity, there was only one goal: escape. They knew that staying on the island meant certain death, either by starvation, disease, or the knife of a cannibal. They looked at the Ob River not as a barrier, but as their only hope. But the geography was against them. The river was wide, the current was violent, and the water was freezing. Despite this, desperation drove hundreds of people to the shoreline. They had no tools to build boats. They tore up willow branches with their bare hands. They used strips of clothing from the dead to tie rotten driftwood together. They built flimsy, desperate rafts that could barely float. And then they pushed off into the icy current. This was exactly what the guards were waiting for. For the bored, sadistic sentries patrolling the perimeter on patrol boats, the escape attempts were not a security breach, they were entertainment. The archives describe scenes that sound like a twisted sport. As soon as a raft drifted away from the shore, the guards wouldn't chase it immediately. They would let it drift for a few hundred meters, letting the prisoners believe they had made it. Then the machine guns would open fire. It was shooting practice. They shredded the wooden rafts and the people on them. Those who jumped into the water didn't last long. If the bullets didn't get them, the hypothermia did. The bodies didn't drift away to freedom. The river currents around the island were circular. Days later, the bloated, bullet-ridden corpses of the escapees would wash back up onto the shores of Nazino, right at the feet of the people who were planning the next escape. But some guards didn't just shoot, they hunted. Commanders reported that guards would take boats out duck hunting, but they weren't looking for ducks. They were looking for solitary swimmers hiding in the reeds. They would track them, corner them, and kill them for sport. In 1 month, hundreds tried to escape. According to the official count, only a handful ever made it to the mainland alive. And even they were hunted down by local villagers who were given a bounty for every fugitive they caught. The island was a perfect trap. There was no way out. The only way off Nazino was to die. June 1933. The horror on Nazino Island had been raging for weeks. The guards had normalized the violence. The commanders were busy falsifying reports to Moscow, claiming the settlement was developing according to plan. But then an outsider arrived. His name was Vasily Velichko. He was only 24 years old. He was a junior instructor for the Communist Party, sent from the regional capital to report on the progress of the new special villages. Velichko was a true believer. He believed in the Soviet dream. He expected to find pioneers building log cabins and farming the land. When his boat touched the muddy shore of Nazino, that dream shattered instantly. He didn't find a settlement. He found a graveyard inhabited by the walking dead. Velichko walked through the tall grass, his boots sinking into the mud. He saw people who looked like skeletons wrapped in rags. He saw men grazing on moss and tree bark like cattle. He saw the charred remains of fires where the smell of burnt meat still lingered. He approached the camp commander, a man named Sepkov, and asked the obvious question, "What is happening here? Where are the supplies? Where is the discipline?" The commander simply shrugged. They called the prisoners waste. They told Velichko that these people were enemies of the state and that their deaths were a natural filtration process. But Velichko saw something else. He interviewed the survivors. He spoke to the urban elements, the people who looked like him. He heard the stories of the liver hunters. He heard about the gold tooth extractions. He saw the bullet wounds on the survivors' backs. For the first time in weeks, someone looked at the prisoners with eyes that weren't predatory. Velichko realized that if he didn't act, every single person on this island would die, and the local authorities would bury the truth along with the bodies. He made a dangerous decision. He stopped acting like a party instructor and started acting like a detective. He began to secretly collect names. He wrote down dates. He recorded the crimes of the guards. He knew that if the commanders found his notes, he wouldn't leave the island alive. He would just become another accident in the Ob River. But Vasily Velichko kept writing. He was preparing to do the unthinkable. He was going to accuse the secret police of murder. Vasily Velichko left the island, but the island didn't leave him. He returned to his office in the regional capital, trembling with rage. He knew the unwritten rules of the Soviet system. You do not criticize the secret police. You do not report bad news to Moscow. To speak out was usually a death sentence. But Velichko sat down at his typewriter and did exactly that. The document. He wrote an 11-page report. It wasn't a dry bureaucratic summary. It was a scream on paper. He titled it simply, "On the Events in the Nazino Settlement." In it, he described everything. He described the flour and the water. He described the naked battalions. He described the guards shooting people for sport. And he described the cannibalism. He wrote, "People are not dying. They are being exterminated. I am not telling you about the sick imagination of a writer, but about the undeniable reality. The island is covered in skeletons with the soft tissue cut away." The gamble. He didn't send the letter to his immediate boss. He knew his boss would burn it and have him arrested. Instead, Velichko did something incredibly reckless. He made 3 copies. He sent one to Robert Ike, the powerful party boss of Western Siberia. He sent one to the Omni-Union Communist Party in Moscow, and he sent one to Stalin's personal secretariat. He bypassed the entire chain of command. It was political suicide. He sat back and waited for the knock on his door. The response. But the knock didn't come. The report was so shocking, so detailed, and so horrifying that even the hardened men in the Kremlin couldn't ignore it. It caused a scandal. Not because they cared about human life, but because the operation was a spectacular failure of management. It was embarrassing to the state. In September 1933, a special commission from Moscow arrived in Siberia. They traveled to Nazino. They expected to find Velichko exaggerating. Instead, they found the grass full of human bones. They found the survivors in a state of regression so severe they could barely speak. The commission confirmed every single word of Velichko's report. The order was finally given: evacuate the island. The survivors, those few thousand who were left out of the original 6,000, were loaded back onto barges. They were sick, disabled, and traumatized forever, but they were alive. The Nazino experiment was officially declared a failure.
In the end, the math of Nazino Island is terrifying. Of the roughly 6,700 people dumped on the island in May 1933, fewer than 2,200 survived to be evacuated in late June. That means over 4,000 people died in just 30 days. They didn't die in a war. They died because of a signature on a piece of paper. So, who paid the price for this massacre? The investigation commission concluded that the local commanders were negligent. A few guards were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 1 to 3 years. That's it. They served their time and went back to their lives. The high-ranking architects of the plan in Moscow faced no consequences for Nazino. Although, in a twist of irony, Genrikh Yagoda, the head of the secret police who authorized the deportation, was executed by Stalin 5 years later during the Great Purge. And what about Vasily Velichko, the man who risked his life to write the letter? He was fired from his job as an instructor for being politically immature, but miraculously he was not arrested. He went on to become a war correspondent during World War II and lived until the 1980s. He spent the rest of his life trying to forget the smell of burning meat on the Ob River. For decades, the Soviet Union tried to erase Nazino from the map. The documents were sealed. The island was left to grow over with weeds. But the story survived because it teaches us a fundamental truth about human nature. Nazino proved that civilization is a thin layer of ice. Take away food, take away warmth, take away hope, and that ice breaks. The tragedy wasn't just that people ate each other. The tragedy was that a government created a petri dish specifically designed to make that happen, and then watched it unfold with indifference. This concludes the file on the Nazino Tragedy. We investigate the dark corners of history that textbooks ignore. If you want us to cover the Dyatlov Pass incident or the Russian sleep experiment next, vote in the comments below. And one final request: YouTube often suppresses content like this because it is too dark. Please share this video with one friend who likes history. Help us keep the memory of these 4,000 people alive. Thanks for watching. Stay vigilant.